My name is Michael Edeo, and I want to speak to you plainly, the way a man tells the truth when he has nothing left to hide. For years, I lived a life that most people sitting quietly in church pews would never imagine. Not even for a moment. I walked into places where the lights were low and the air felt heavy, where candles burned all through the night as if time itself had slowed down. I stood there and watched it happen night after night. I attended midnight gatherings where men and women spoke in whispers, saying prayers that did not come from heaven. And even then, something inside me knew that what I was hearing wasn't right. During the day, these same people looked ordinary. You could pass them on the street and never think twice. But when the clock struck 12 midnight, I saw them change. It was as if something else stepped in, something hidden, something hidden, something he couldn't quite explain. And I'll tell you honestly, what shocked me the most wasn't the rituals I saw. It wasn't the sacrifices. It wasn't even the strange spiritual experiences that would have unsettled most people. No, what stayed with me, what really shook me, was something entirely different. There was one chapter in the Bible that brought a kind of fear into those meetings whenever it was mentioned, and it wasn't what you might expect. It wasn't the book of Revelation with all its mysteries. It wasn't the story of Moses. It wasn't even the miracles of Jesus. It was Psalm 91. Yes, Psalm 91. The same psalm many Christians read quickly before going to sleep, the same one people quote without really stopping to understand what they're saying. But in those meetings, when someone mentioned Psalm 91, everything shifted. The atmosphere changed in a way you could feel without anyone needing to explain it. The elders would say something that puzzled me for years. They would say that many Christians read it, but very few understand the weapon hidden inside it. And when they said that, they would laugh, not a joyful laugh, but the kind that comes from believing you know something others have missed. They were convinced that the church had overlooked something important. At the time, I didn't understand what they meant. I just listened, the way a young man listens when he thinks he's learning something valuable. But one night, many years later, I saw the power of that psalm in a way that changed everything I believed. I saw a man survive attacks that, by all logic, should have destroyed him. I saw a house surrounded by a presence that none of us could penetrate, no matter what was attempted. And that night, I discovered something that would eventually lead me out of darkness and into the light of Jesus Christ. But before I tell you what happened that night, you need to understand how I got there in the first place. Because the truth is, nobody wakes up one morning and decides to walk into darkness. It doesn't happen that way. It happens slowly, step by step, choice by choice. One small decision leads to another, and before you know it, you find yourself standing in places you never imagined you would be. I was born in Ibadan, Nigeria. My father, Samuel Ado, was a commercial bus driver. He worked hard, long hours, doing what he could to provide for us. My mother, Grace Adayo, sold pepper and tomatoes at Bodiha Market. We were not rich, not even close. In fact, there were many days when things were difficult. I remember nights when my mother would pretend she wasn't hungry just so we children could eat. She never complained, but you could see it if you paid attention. Growing up in that kind of environment shapes you. For me, it created a strong desire, one clear goal. I wanted to escape poverty. I didn't want to live that life forever. I wanted something different, something better. And that desire, as simple as it sounds, set the stage for everything that came after. I had a close friend, a boy named Tan Balok. Tond was different from me in many ways. His family had wealth. They lived in a large house in Olu Estates, the kind of place that makes an impression on you the first time you see. Whenever I visited his house, I saw things my family could never afford. There was air condition, large televisions, new cars, and all the comforts that come with money. At first, I just noticed these things, but over time, something else began to grow inside me. It was quiet at first, but it didn't stay that way. It was jealousy. One evening, when we were both about 18 years old, Tan said something to me that I didn't fully understand at the time, but it stayed with me. We said, Michael, there are people who control wealth spiritually. I remember laughing when he said it. It sounded strange, almost like a story someone would make up. But he didn't laugh. He kept talking, and there was a seriousness in his voice that made me listen. He told me that some of the most powerful men in business were not successful by ordinary means. He said there were hidden spiritual networks behind many powerful people, systems that operated in ways most people never see. At that point, I thought he might be exaggerating, maybe even joking in a way I didn't fully catch. But then, one night, he invited me somewhere. He didn't explain much. He just said it was a meeting, and something about the way he said it made me curious. Now, curiosity can be a dangerous thing if it's not guided properly. I didn't know it at the time, but that invitation would change my life in ways I could never have predicted. The meeting wasn't in a church, it wasn't held in any public place where people could come and go freely. It was inside a large house on the outskirts of Ibadan. As soon as we entered the compound, I sensed something was different. I couldn't explain it clearly, but the air felt heavy, almost as if it carried a weight you couldn't see. Inside the house, there were about 12 people seated around the table. They didn't all look the same. Some appeared to be businessmen. Others looked like professors, educated, composed. One man even looked like a politician. These weren't the kind of people you would expect to find in a setting like that. At least not if you were thinking in ordinary terms. The leader of the meeting was a man named Mr. Richard Okafor. He spoke in a calm and confident manner, the kind that makes people pay attention without raising his voice. He began talking about spiritual influence, explaining it in a way that made it sound structured, almost logical. He said there are forces that control events in the world, forces most people never consider. Then he said something that caught my attention and stayed with me. He said that those who understand the spiritual dimension can shape their destiny. Now, when you hear something like that as a young man trying to escape poverty, it has a certain appeal. It sounds like an answer, like a shortcut to something you've been searching for. At the end of the meeting, he asked if anyone wanted to join a deeper circle, something more committed, more involved. I didn't fully understand what that meant, but I was curious. And like I said, curiosity can lead you into places you never intended to go. So I took that step. It didn't feel like a big decision at the time. It felt small, almost insignificant, but looking back, I can tell you it was the moment everything began to change. It was the first step I took into darkness, even though I didn't recognize it as darkness yet. Over the next few months, I continued attending those meetings, just taking it one step at a time, telling myself I was only observing, only learning. But things don't stay the same for long in a place like that. Eventually, the meetings changed. They moved from ordinary evenings into midnight gatherings, and that shift alone should have told me something. But at the time, I ignored it. Those midnight meetings were very different from what I had first experienced. Candles were placed carefully around the room, not randomly but with intention. Symbols were drawn on the floor, patterns I didn't fully understand. Incense burned in bowls, filling the air with a thick, heavy scent. The atmosphere was intense, the kind that makes you aware that you've stepped into something deeper than you expected. Sometimes those meetings lasted until 3 or 4 in the morning, and by the time they ended, you felt like you had been somewhere far removed from ordinary life during those gatherings. We were taught things that were presented as knowledge, as power, strange spiritual practices, meditations, invocations, rituals, all described as ways to attract influence and control. At first, I told myself I thought I was just learning something different, something hidden. But little by little, the nature of those activities began to change. They became darker, much darker, and by the time I noticed it clearly, I was already involved. One night, during one of those gatherings, a discussion started about spiritual protection. It seemed like a simple topic at first, but the way people listened told you it was important. One of the older members, a man named Elder Patrick Mensa, began to speak. He was respected in the group, someone who had lived in several African countries and claimed to have deep spiritual knowledge. As the conversation continued, someone asked a question that changed the direction of everything. They asked which kind of spiritual protection was the hardest to break. When that question was asked, the room went quiet. No one rushed to answer. It was the kind of silence that tells you everyone is thinking carefully. Then Elder Patrick spoke. He said there are Christians who carry a kind of protection that cannot easily be penetrated. That answer caught my attention right away. It didn't fit with what I thought I was learning. Naturally, someone asked him why, and his response was simple, but it carried weight. He said, PM 91. At that moment, several people nodded, as if they already understood what he meant. But then he added something that confused me even more. He said they read it, but they do not understand the real power inside it. And after he said that, people laughed. It was the same kind of laughter I had heard before, the kind that suggests they believed they knew something others didn't. At that at time, I didn't understand what he meant. It sounded like a statement without a clear explanation, but I remembered it. And later, I would come to understand exactly what he was talking about, not through theory, but through experience. As the years passed, I became more deeply involved in the group. What had started as curiosity slowly turned into participation. I didn't see it happening in a single moment. It was gradual, like everything else. One step led to another, and before long, I was part of something I once would have avoided. Then one day, we traveled to Lagos for what was described as a spiritual operation. By that time, I had heard that term enough to know it meant something serious. Our target was a successful businessman named Dan Wuku. He owned several construction companies and was known for his success. According to what we were told, he had refused to join certain networks. And in that world, refusal can make you a target. Our leader believed we could influence his business, apply pressure, and eventually bring him into a position where he would have no choice but to comply. Several rituals were performed. Everything was done the way we had been taught, carefully, deliberately. But something unexpected happened. Every single attempt failed. Not one of them worked. It didn't make sense based on what we believed at the time. Our leader became frustrated. You could see it in his expression, in the way he spoke. He said something was protecting this man, something strong enough to resist everything being done. That wasn't something we were used to hearing. So a decision was made. Instead of continuing blindly, we would observe him. We wanted to understand what was behind this protection, what made it different. One night, we positioned ourselves near his house. We stayed at a distance, careful not to be noticed. Around 11 p.m., the lights in his home were still on. Through the window, we could see him sitting at a table. There was nothing unusual about the setting at first glance. Then we noticed something important. A Bible was open in front of him. He began to pray, and after that, he started reading something out loud. It was Psalm 91. But what stood out wasn't just that he was reading it, it was how he was reading it. He didn't rush through it the way many people do. He read slowly, carefully, as if each word mattered. He paused between verses, taking his time. Sometimes he lifted his hands in worship. Sometimes he would stop and pray over the words he had just read. It wasn't just reading, it was something deeper, something personal. And then something happened. that I still find difficult to fully explain. As he continued, the atmosphere around the house began to change. It wasn't something you could see with your eyes in a simple way, but you could feel it clearly. It was as if a presence had filled the area, something strong, something steady. Our leader noticed it immediately. His reaction was quick. He said, "We must leave." There was no hesitation in his voice. Whatever we had come to do, it was clear we could not continue. That, that night, something inside me shifted. I didn't say anything to anyone, but I began to question everything I thought I understood. For the first time, I considered the possibility that we were not as powerful as we believed. Months later, I began to study Psalm 91 on my own, quietly, without telling anyone. I didn't want attention. I just wanted to understand. I read it again and again, slowly, the way that men in Lagos had done. And as I did, certain parts began to stand out to me in a way they never had before. The first verse caught my attention more than anything else. It speaks about dwelling in the secret place of the Most High and abiding under the shadow of the Almighty. That word dwells stayed with me. It troubled me because I realized something simple but important. Many people read the psalm, but very few actually dwell in God's presence. And when I thought about the man in Lagos, it became clear. He didn't just read the scripture, he spent time with God. He prayed, he worshiped, he lived in obedience. That was the difference. It was the difference. It was a relationship, something real, something lived out daily. That realization stayed with me and it continued to grow quietly inside me, leading me towards something I hadn't expected when I first walked into that house years before. One night, not long after all of that, I had a dream that unsettled me in a way I couldn't ignore. It didn't feel like an ordinary dream, the kind that fades when you wake up. It stayed with me, clear and steady. In that dream, I found myself standing in a dark valley. There was no light around me, just shadows moving in ways that made it hard to know what was real and what wasn't. As I stood there, I could feel the weight of that place. It wasn't just darkness you could see, it was something you could sense, something that pressed in on you. Then, in the distance, I saw a light. It wasn't small or uncertain. It was bright, steady, and it stood out against everything around it. Then I heard a voice call my name, Michael. It wasn't loud, but it was clear. It carried authority, the kind you don't question. I turned toward the light, and the voice spoke again. How long will you remain here? There was something in that question that went beyond words. It wasn't just asking for an answer, it was calling for a decision. When I woke up, I was trembling. I didn't brush it aside or try to forget it. It stayed with me, and I knew it meant something. The next morning, I reached for a Bible, almost without thinking. I opened it, and the first passage I saw was Psalm 91. At that point, I couldn't ignore the connection anymore. The same chapter, that had been mentioned in those meetings, the same one I had seen the men in Logos read, was now in front of me again. Not long after that, I traveled to Abu Duja for business. It was a normal trip, nothing unusual about it on the surface. But one Sunday morning, I decided to enter a small church in Wooz. It wasn't a large building. It didn't stand out in any obvious way. But something led me there. The pastor's name was Pastor David Olaren Wanju. He spoke that day about the secret place of God. As I sat there and listened, I realized he was talking about the very thing I had been trying to understand. He explained that spiritual protection doesn't come from simply quoting scripture. It comes from a relationship with God. That idea settled into me in a way I couldn't ignore. It connected everything I had seen and experienced, the words I had heard in those meetings, the man in Lagos, the dream I had, all of it pointed to the same truth. As he continued speaking, I felt something happening inside me. It wasn't loud or dramatic, but it was clear. His words reached a place in me that nothing else had reached before. It was as if something I had been avoiding was now right in front of me. After the service ended, I didn't leave right away. I went to him and began to talk. What started as a simple conversation turned into hours. I told him everything, not holding anything back. I spoke about the meetings, the rituals, the things I had seen and done. He didn't interrupt. He just listened, quietly, patiently. When I finished, he didn't react with shock or judgment. Instead, he prayed for me. It was a simple act, but it carried weight. And in that moment, something changed. During that prayer, I felt something lift from my life. It's difficult to describe. I be in precise terms, but it was real. It felt like chains breaking, like a burden I had carried without fully realizing it was being removed. For the first time in years, I felt peace. Not the kind of peace that comes and goes, but something steady, something real. It wasn't based on circumstances, it was deeper than that. In that moment, I made a decision. I surrendered my life to Jesus Christ. It wasn't forced, it wasn't pressured, it was clear, and it felt right. When I left that place, I knew I wasn't the same person who had walked in. Something had shifted, and I understood things in a way I hadn't before. I finally understood what the elders had meant when they spoke about Psalm 91, but they hadn't understood it the way they thought they did. The secret wasn't hidden in the words alone. The secret weapon in Psalm 91 is not merely the words. The real power is in the secret place. When a person truly dwells in God's presence, not occasionally, not casually, but consistently, something changes. Fear begins to lose its hold. The things that once seemed overwhelming start to lose their strength. Spiritual attacks, no matter how strong they appear, begin to lose their power, and the protection described and that sound becomes something real, not just something spoken. It's not about repeating verses quickly or out of habit. It's about relationship. It's about staying connected to God in a way that is steady and genuine. And and when I looked back at everything I had seen, it all made sense. The man in Lagos wasn't protected because he read the psalm. He was protected because he lived in that place, the place where God's presence is real. That's what we could not penetrate. That's what we could not overcome. Now, as I speak to you, I want you to understand this clearly. If you are listening, this is not complicated. It doesn't require anything hidden or secret, the way the world describes it. It requires a relationship with God. And if you are willing, you can begin right where you are. You don't need to wait for the right moment. You don't need perfect conditions. You can turn to God and speak honestly. You can ask Him to break every chain of darkness in your life. You can ask Him to destroy every hidden attack against you, according to Psalm 91. You can ask Him to send His angels to guard you, to surround you with His presence. And when you do that, not just with words, but with a sincere heart, something begins to change because the power is not in repeating something without understanding. The power is in dwelling, in staying, in remaining in that place with Him. That is where everything begins to shift. After everything I had gone through, I reached a point where I no longer wanted to carry what I had been carrying. So I spoke to you the way I would speak if I were sitting right in front of you without hiding anything. If you are listening, I want you to understand that I didn't find peace through effort or through trying to fix everything myself. It came when I began to turn my life back to God in a simple and honest way. And in that moment, I began to pray, not as something complicated, but as something direct, the way a person speaks when they know they need help. I said, Father, in the name of Jesus, let every chain of darkness be broken. I ask that every hidden attack against my life be destroyed, according to Psalm 91. I continued asking that His protection would cover me, that nothing formed against me would stand. I asked Him to send His angels to guard my life, to keep watch over me, and to surround me with His presence. I didn't try to make the words perfect. I just spoke from where I was. And I want you to understand something here. It was not about repeating words without meaning. It was not about trying to force something to happen. It was about sincerity. It was about turning back fully without holding anything back. As I prayed, I began to realize something simple but important. Everything I had been searching for in all those places, all those meetings, all those experiences, it was never truly there. It was never about hidden power or secret knowledge the way I once believed. It was about presence. It was about relationship. It was about God being near. And as I continued, I felt the weight of everything I had carried begin to shift. Not all at once, but clearly enough that I could not deny it. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't afraid in the same way anymore. Something had changed inside me. I remember saying, "Let every plan of the enemy fail. Let every hidden work against my life be brought to nothing." I asked to be surrounded completely, not just in words, but in reality, by the presence of God. And I said it the way you would say something when you finally believe that help is possible, when you stop doubting whether change can come. I continued, "Let your angels guard me. Let your protection be over my life, in Jesus' name." And it was at that point, in that moment of prayer, that everything felt like it was reaching a turning point. In that moment, everything I had lived through started to make sense in a way I had never understood before, not as separate events, not as confusing memories, but as one continuous path that had led me here. I could see how step by step, choice by choice, I had moved from one place to another without realizing how far I had gone. And now, standing in this new understanding, I could say it clearly. What I once thought was power was not what it appeared to be. What I once thought was control over destiny was not control at all. It was something that eventually led to confusion, fear, and emptiness. B. It what I found in God was different. It was steady. It was real. It was not loud or forced. It didn't need to prove itself. It simply was. When I think back to Psalm 91, I understand why it created fear in those meetings. Not because of the words themselves alone, but because of what the words point to. The idea of dwelling, of staying, of remaining in the secret place was something we did not understand at the time. We thought it was about reading. We thought it was about saying the right verses, but it was never just that. It was about living in a relationship with God, where His presence becomes the covering, the strength, and the protection. And when I saw the man in Lagos reading slowly, praying, pausing, worshiping, I didn't understand it then, but now I see it clearly. He wasn't relying on words alone. He was living in that place of connection with God. That is what we could not break. That is what we could not break. Not because of the words on the page, but because of the life behind them. And I want to say this to you as clearly as I can. If you are listening and you feel like you are searching for something, don't make the same mistake I made, thinking it is hidden somewhere far away or locked behind something complicated. It is not far, it is not hidden in the way people imagine. It is found in turning your heart toward God and staying there, not for a moment, not only when things are difficult, but consistently in daily life, in honesty, in prayer, in surrender. That is what it means to dwell. And when you dwell, fear loses its authority. The things that once seemed overwhelming begin to lose their grip. Not because life becomes perfect, but because you are no longer alone in it. That is what I discovered at the end of everything I went through. That is what brought me out of the path I was on and into something completely different. A. And now, When I look back, I don't see just darkness and confusion. I see direction. I see mercy. I see a path that led me to understand something I would have never understood otherwise. So I leave you with this understanding, not as something complicated, but as something simple. Stay in that place with God, dwell there, remain there, and everything else will begin to take its proper place. If this message has reached you and it has spoken to your heart in any way, then don't just walk away from it. Take a moment to reflect on it, share it with someone who needs it, and stay connected for more messages like this. And if you haven't already, please subscribe so you don't miss the next part of this journey.